All right, hello everyone. In this video, I'm going to be briefly talking about some various subjects related to questions about work and what makes work meaningful, how work might fit into a good life, and also just some general concerns about the nature of professionalism. And I don't mean professionalism in terms of like codes of etiquette per se, what it means to dress professionally and things like that. If as you can tell, I don't put much stock in that sort of notion of professionalism, but in particular, how we might make a distinction between having a having a profession and having a job. If you had to articulate to somebody what the difference is between being a professional and simply having a job, how might you actually go about articulating that? Okay, so let's start there. Okay, so what might be the difference then between having a job, and actually being a member of a given profession, right? Now, since I've already sort of framed it in that way, having a job versus being a member of a profession, that already kind of gives away part of what this difference is. Okay, so here are just some highlights of what some of the differences are. Okay, so professions, unlike jobs, typically come with specialized training and education, where if you're performing a job, all you really need is some sort of on-site training, but this doesn't always extend far. So if you think about craftsman guilds and things like this and apprenticeships, a lot of those jobs do come with various kinds of specialized skills which one acquires over a long period of time. But with those kinds of jobs, even there's not necessarily licensing or special education and testing that you need to go through. So you can get on the job training, which is incredibly specialized in terms of craftsmanship and things like this. But as far as actually getting educated formally to pass some sort of licensing examination or something like that, even in craftsman positions, that's not always the case. Now, working towards being a member of a given profession um, comes with certain education and training requirements, but you also become part of a group of fellow experts, if you will, okay, where you are all sort of equally qualified in a given field or a given discipline, but it also comes with sort of bonds of professionalism and special opportunities for sort of communicating with and collaborating with other members of your particular discipline or other members of your particular craft, if you will. Okay. Now, but it's also the case that being a member of a given profession, unlike having a job, also comes with a unique set of obligations. Okay. And it's here that there's an interesting interplay between obligations that we might have generally as members of a given society and the kinds of professional obligations that we have. Okay, and if you think about this, in education, for example, we have FERPA, the Family Education Rights Protection Act. So what that means is that instructors and administrators of universities and colleges have to keep student records confidential. So, if a student's parent emails me and says, "Hey, I'm paying for my child's education. I would like to know if you're attending their class. I would like to know if they are attending your class, professor." Legally speaking, I have no right whatsoever to disclose that information to the parent. Not only do I have no right to disclose it, but the parent also has no right to that information. The student's academic record is protected. In the medical field, we have HIPAA laws, dealing with confidentiality and privacy of personal information related to your medical record and things like this. Now, but FERPA only applies to me as an educator. I mean, if I had never gotten into higher education, I would be protected in terms of, being a student. But as far as professional obligations that correspond to these kinds of things, those wouldn't apply to me. And if you're not a member of a medical field or something like that, HIPAA wouldn't apply to you. So these are specialized obligations based on the kind of professional that you are and the kind of field that you are in professionally. Okay. But the other side of this is that as a member of a given profession, your code of ethics or certain kinds of obligations that you have might actually conflict with general obligations that we have in society. Okay. So, for example, it's generally immoral to cut people with knives, but that's your trade if you are a surgeon, right? So, if you just like cutting people, hey, have I got a profession for you? Maybe look into becoming a surgeon. Um, in general, it is wrong to conceal information about whether you know that somebody is guilty of a crime. However, if you are a defense attorney, that is exactly what your job is. So keep this in mind. If you go into the practice of law and you become a defense attorney, even if you know that your client is guilty, which a lot of times defense attorneys actually do know whether or not their client committed a crime. Okay. Um, if you're a defense attorney, it is your job to defend your client, even if you know that your client is guilty. So, your job as the defense attorney is to give your client the best defense possible, to poke holes in the prosecution's case, to sow reasonable doubt in the minds of the jurors and things like that. But even if your client behind closed doors in confidentiality says, hey, I actually did it and I'm really worried, I'm really worried about this evidence and so on and so forth. Even if I know that as your defense attorney that you are guilty of the crime, I am still violating my professional obligations by blowing the case. So even if I know you actually are guilty, I still have a professional obligation towards you as your defense attorney to give you the best defense possible. But if I sneak information to the prosecution so that the evidence is just overwhelming. I mean, if I throw the case and you end up being convicted because of some impropriety that I committed as your defense attorney, I will be disbarred, I will be fired. That is grossly unprofessional and unethical, in the area of law. Now, and the reason why we have defense attorneys is because the stakes are, we recognize in society that the stakes are incredibly high when it comes to criminal trials and those kinds of things. We recognize that, okay, we need a system of law here. We need a justice system where we have a prosecution and a defense, because if all we did was have a prosecution, then everybody would be going to jail. Now, and that's why we put the burden of proof on the prosecution rather than on the defense. So the defense's job is just to poke holes in the prosecution's case and sow reasonable doubt in the minds of the jurors, such that the evidence that we have available is not enough to convict the client. But man, the common citizen, if I've got evidence that a crime has been committed and I don't report that evidence, that's grossly immoral if you're a common citizen. But hey, if you're a defense attorney, you're supposed to keep that kind of information confidential. So there's a difference between falsifying evidence, whether you're a prosecuting attorney or a defense attorney, you can't falsify evidence. But there's a difference between not disclosing something that would prove the prosecution's case for them, right, and actually falsifying evidence to throw the prosecution off. Those are two completely different. Okay, and then one really important aspect of the difference between jobs and a profession is that one's profession really becomes an informative and a meaningful and an important aspect of who they are as an individual. Okay, there is no time of the day when I am not a philosopher. Not even when I am asleep, really, because even when I'm asleep, I have dreams about philosophy and have really philosophy laden dreams and things like this. There's no time during the day where I am not a philosopher, where um, as both a professor of philosophy and just a philosopher, one who does philosophy, that's who I am. I am a philosopher. So I am a philosopher who teaches philosophy professionally. So I earn a living. I am able to afford a house, and I am able to feed my family, and I'm able to have really nice cardigans that I find at Goodwill for $2. I can afford $2 cardigans because I get paid money to do this, to do philosophy. But I love philosophy. It's part of who I am. I can't switch it off, right? Um, if you go into the medical field, your obligations as a practitioner of medicine extend beyond when you are on the clock, right? So if you're a doctor, if you're an ER doctor and you're out in public on a day off and someone near you is having a heart attack, you don't get to check out and say, my day off, I'm off the clock. No, that's who you are. You are a doctor. If you're a paramedic or a firefighter or a first responder of some kind, even when you are off duty, the obligations that you have as a member of that given profession still extend to you even when you're off duty, right? So, if you're a paramedic and you fail to give emergency aid to somebody even when you're off the clock, you can be held liable for that kind of thing. Um, how often do we hear stories about off-duty police officers and off-duty firefighters and things like that helping out in situations even when they are technically not on the clock? Okay, well, they do that because that is exactly what they are supposed to do. The oath that you swear when you work into those, when you go into those kinds of professions, those don't just extend to your particular working hours, right? And that's why it becomes your profession becomes an integral part of who you are. And once you've been doing it for a long time, once you have that specialized training, once you have that expertise, once you have that degree, once you have that membership in various professional organizations and things like that, it's it's inevitable that it becomes who you are. Now, and that is why if there is some sort of impression or feeling that you are failing as a member of this given profession. So that's why inevitably we end up feeling like we fail as human individuals, or we feel like failures in our lives, all things considered, or just broadly based on the fact that we feel that we are failing in our professional lives. So whether or not who we are as professionals becomes an integral part of who we are as just human individuals or citizens of a given society, whether it's a good thing or a bad thing, that inevitably our professional lives just become so wholly integrated in our personal lives that oftentimes they're indistinguishable from each other. Whether that's a good thing or a bad thing remains to be seen, but psychologically and culturally and socially, that's just the way things are. That does not seem to be the case with a job. If I'm working a job for the sake of some other end, that's, oh, I'm just doing this to get by while I pay for college, or I'm just doing this part time until my band gets a record deal, right? How many of us would say, oh yeah, I'm just doing philosophy part time until my brothers want to get the band back together, and we're gonna go on tour and make millions of dollars selling, quadruple platinum albums and things. Yeah, that's what's coming in the long run. Okay, whatever. Um, if you're just doing something, making ends meet for the sake of using it as a springboard to something else, the things that you use as a springboard for the sake of something else, something that you use instrumentally towards accomplishing some other kinds of goals, we don't appropriate those kinds of things into our personal lives in this same way that we do with our professions. Okay, But if you think about the way we talk about jobs and professions, one of the most common questions that you get, whether if you're on a date or you're making new friends or something like that, when we ask people, okay, what do you do? We almost always are asking them what their profession is or what their job is, right? But if you ask somebody, who are you? So we've got the one question, what do you do? Oh, I work part-time at a bookstore. Oh, I'm a gardener, right? But if we ask, who are you? If you're a professional of a given craft or discipline or specialization, if somebody asks you, who are you? You'll often answer, with that. Well, I am John and I'm a philosophy professor. But if somebody asks me, what do I do? Right. And if it was just a job, I would say, oh, I do this. Now, but those two things are not always so easily separable. So I jokingly, anytime somebody asks me, well, what do you do? I say, oh, I do lots of things. I drink single malt scotch and I consume smoked cheeses, and I make really good egg breakfast sandwiches, low cal, just a little over 200 calories. I do really well at that. And they'll stop me and be like, no, 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 that's not what I mean. What's your job? I was like, oh, so you're not asking me about my life. You're asking me what kinds of menial tasks I perform to make money. I mean, that's basically the job. But who I am as a professional that seems to be a distinct question from the actual tasks that I perform to make a living. All right. I don't know if any of that makes sense. That might just be a convoluted mess. I could be wrong about all of this, but no, that seems to make sense. Okay. Now, in the next part, we're just going to talk a little bit about why we work. So why do individuals actually work? Now, again, if you were to actually survey people and ask them questions about why they work, you're going to get obviously varied responses, and it seems that people can work for several different sorts of reasons. Okay, now, and that's part of what's going on in Yeoman's article about meaningful work being a fundamental human need. So one model of work says no, people can work for whatever reason that they want, and it's not our job to sort of set conditions socially so that individuals are funneled into certain kinds of jobs or they find their work meaningful. Whether or not somebody has meaningful work, that is fully up to them to make their work meaningful. Yaman completely disagrees with that kind of perspective. I'll say a little bit more about that momentarily. Okay, now here's what we could sort of characterize as the classical model of work. The classical model of work says that work ought to be avoided if possible, but it's often a necessary evil. So the classical model says that, okay, if we think about the nature of work, work is predominantly something that is negative. Work is predominantly something that is negative. If we can avoid working, we ought to avoid working. However, given the actual conditions that we find ourselves in most societies and most cultures, work is a necessary evil. It's something that you have to do to be able to do other things that you want to do. Okay, so according to the classical model, work only has instrumental value. So that means that work is not desired as an end in itself. Work is not desired as an end in itself. Work is only desired because work and working tends to promote other kinds of goods that we desire, other kinds of goods that we find fulfilling. Okay, so according to the classical model, then, if the goods associated with work can be achieved by other means, it is better not to work. So if the goods that are associated with work, whatever kinds of goods there are that working accomplishes instrumentally, if those goods associated with work can be achieved by other means, be achieved by not working at all, then all things considered, it is just better to not work at all. Okay, now, and when Yauman is talking about John Rawls' compensation principle, That's part of what is going on here with this discussion. Okay, so according to John Rawls, whether or not an individual has dignified work or meaningful work can be offset by whether or not they enjoy other kinds of freedom or other kinds of autonomy or other kinds of things that make life meaningful outside of work. Okay, so according to John Rawls, even if as a job, or even if in my work is somewhat undignified, I'm not pleased with it. The kind of work that I am performing in society is not exactly what we would call attractive work. It's not the kind of job, it's not the kind of work that people would go out of their way to do. It's kind of work that would be performed only under the sorts of conditions where you didn't have any other kind of choice. Okay. Now, and that's what really becomes important here, this notion of choice and what kinds of opportunities for certain kinds of work are open to certain kinds of individuals in society. So John Rawls thinks that it is fair in society for some people to have less attractive forms of work or less dignified forms of work or less meaningful forms of work. They're doing the jobs that nobody else wants to do, so long as they have opportunities for self fulfillment, for free choice, for self improvement and self betterment in other areas of life. So if somebody is compensated for the fact that their work is not meaningful or is undignified or is, all things considered, socially speaking, unattractive, if they are justly or fairly compensated in other areas of life, that makes up for the fact that their work is not dignified. That makes up for the fact that their work is not particularly meaningful to them, so on and so forth. Okay. Now, what Yauman calls liberal neutralism is just what I'll refer to here as the classical liberal model. Okay. And according to the classical liberal model of work, why people work is entirely up to them. Okay. Now, what the classical liberal model emphasizes is the fact that people are free to engage in whatever kinds of work that they deem fit or they deem necessary. And whether or not that work is meaningful to them, that is fully up to them. Okay. So if you're doing a job part time just to make ends meet and you have loftier goals, you're working a job to pay your bills, you're working a job to pay for school, whatever the case may be. If it's just a stepping stone, then according to the classical liberal model, that is perfectly fine. Now, but if you find your work meaningful, you make it meaningful, and keep in mind what I talked about in the previous video. Whether or not something is meaningful to you is largely a matter of whether or not you appropriate it as such, whether you use it as an opportunity for meaning making in your life. According to the classical liberal model, whether your work is meaningful to you, that is entirely up to you. You are free to make it meaningful. You are free to work just in such a way so that it's a stepping stone towards something else. But what the classical liberal model says, and this is why Yauman says that it's a version of liberal neutrality, is that it's somewhat coercive or controlling to organize society in such a way that we require work to be meaningful for individuals. Okay, so according to this model, it would be pretentious, if you will, or it would be sort of prejudgmental, if you will, to organize society in such a way or to have a theory of working which requires people or forces people to set certain kinds of priorities in their work, or for the way we set up society to have it so that work functions in such a way to provide individuals with meaning. Well, what the liberal model says is we can't do that, because in order to do so, we need to force people to prioritize certain goods rather than other kinds of goods. Now, But since the classical liberal model emphasizes human freedom, since it emphasizes human freedom, the classical liberal model says whether individuals recognize work as something that is good, that should be left up to them. So we should not, socially speaking, we should not be forcing people to see work in a certain kind of way or enter work for the sake of pursuing certain kinds of goods. So that's just not society's job. It's not society's job to tell individuals within that society what they should be striving for or ought to be striving for or what actually is meaningful. That is wholly up to the individual to determine what is meaningful for themselves. Okay, so what the liberal model emphasizes here is people can work for any number of reasons. That is wholly up to them, and we shouldn't be sort of kind of from the top down. We shouldn't sort of in the sort of top down way operate on a specific mindset of what the meaning and value of work is and kind of pigeonholing people. Well, you should be doing this with your work, or you should be doing that with your work. So we should not be organizing society in such a way according to a theory of work as a meaning making activity. And because what that does is that largely forces people, if you will, to prioritize certain goods over others with the way that they work. So according to the model of liberal neutrality, no, it should be left up to individual citizens themselves to decide for themselves whether or not their work is meaningful. It should be left up to them to decide why they are working and what value there is in work. We shouldn't be telling people in a classical liberal society what they ought to value or what they should value. People can value whatever they want to value. Okay, now, and keep in mind here, by classical liberal, we don't mean liberal in terms of like left versus right. So politically speaking, classical liberalism is a theory of politics and a theory of society which operates on the assumption that human beings are endowed with free will, and our social organization, our economies, our political bodies, and things like that, our governments ought to be organized in such a way that they reflect that. Okay, so according classical liberals say, it's what people do with their own lives, as long as the way they live their own lives doesn't harm anybody else, then how they live their lives is completely up to them. What you value as an individual is completely up to you. I'm not going to tell you the kinds of things that you ought to value or the kinds of things that you should be pursuing in your life. I'm not going to tell you the kinds of things that you ought to be pursuing in your life. Okay. All right. Now, and then we have sort of the broadly Marxist view of work. Okay. Now, Karl Marx thought that this entire distinction between dignified work and undignified work was largely a misnomer, and what it actually reflected, the very notion of dignified versus undignified work. Um, what that really indicated was a sort of class struggle or classism in play here. Karl Marx thought that there was value to working in itself. So work is not merely instrumental. The value of work is in using our creative energies and our expressive entities. When we work, we actually create something, right? Now, and if you think about it, and we'll talk about this when we get to Hannah Arendt's book, The Human Condition. How many of us in our free time do we still engage in work, right? How many of us, even in our free time, doing what you and I call hobbies or, taking time for ourselves or relaxing, nevertheless exert labor power, as Karl Marx says, or nevertheless exert energy or use creative energies even when we're not doing our jobs. Okay, so you might have a job doing one kind of thing, but what if a hobby of yours is carpentry? Well, you're still exerting labor power. You're still using your creative energies. You're still working, right? So Marx kinds of thinks of work just in terms of that, you know, um, using your labor power freely, or exerting your creative energies freely. Hannah Arendt you know, Hannah Arendt makes a different distinction between labor and work, which we'll get into later. She thinks they're not the same thing. But if we just understand work in terms of using creative energies or exerting our labor power, using up our labor power in pursuit of some kind of goal, a lot of us do that in our hobbies. A lot of us do that doing things that we just enjoy for their own sake. So, since work, just by its very nature, involves the use of creative energy and involves the use of labor power, if that is where the value of work resides, then all work is inherently or intrinsically valuable. If using your creative energies or exerting labor power is by itself something good, whether you're doing a job or whether you're doing a profession, if you're using your exertive energies to accomplish a certain kind of goal, there's some sort of value in that. Okay. Now, but for Karl Marx, as we'll see, the problem with a lot of jobs socially is that they become exploitative, where an individual is no longer freely exerting their creative energies, or an individual is no longer freely using their labor power. So Karl Marx thinks that under exploitative capitalist conditions, your labor power actually becomes a commodity for someone else. It actually becomes somebody else's property in a really alienating and really sort of like, oh my goodness, sort of shocking kind of way. So we'll get to that when we talk about Marxist theory of alienation, right? But Marx thinks that there is just creative value in working itself. So even in kind of like a Marxist utopia, we still got work to do. Even in Christianity, for example, I mean, God engages in work. Look at the creation narrative in Genesis. God is working, God is creating, right? Even in paradise, in the Genesis narrative, Adam and Eve have work to do. God gives them jobs to do. Adam is responsible for naming the animals, and Adam and Eve are responsible for tending to the gardens. They're responsible for pastorally shepherding paradise and shepherding the earth that God has created. So work is not a negative thing on the story. I know that in specifically in Christian circles, Karl Marx is often given a bad rap, but the things that Karl Marx says about the value of work, I don't think are contrary to anything within Christianity. I think they deeply resonate with this idea. The first stories we are told about our humanity in the creation narrative is that not only does God engage in creative activities and freely engage in creative energies, but that is largely why God created us. So, in one sense, that is what it means to be created in God's image. We have the power to create something. We have the power to make something new through our labor power and through our energies. There's something deeply meaningful and beautiful about that. I think Karl Marx is right about this, right? Okay. Now, but let's get to this question about dignified and undignified work. What does it mean for work to be dignified? Socially speaking, whether or not one is engaged in dignified work seems to be a matter of what our sort of societal consciousness says about work that is attractive and work that is not attractive. I mean, and I'm not going to use specific examples, but if you find yourselves looking at the jobs that other people are doing or the work that other people are performing, and you might think to yourself, why on earth would anybody want to do that? Well, the answer could be nobody really wants to perform that kind of work. It could be that people are forced to perform that kind of work. Okay. So this is one area where I think that Yauman is absolutely right. One of the reasons why Yauman thinks that the compensation argument fails, John Rawls' compensation argument fails, is because of how, particularly in capitalist, free market, democratic societies, our ability to pursue good things in life and meaningful things in life is predicated upon our work, meaning that we have to work to live. We have to work in order to pursue good things in life, maybe that are outside of work, but we also kind of live to work. I mean, that's where, especially under capitalism, we get into this vicious cycle where we are working to live, but we are also living to work. Okay, so one example of this is home ownership. So I read an article years ago. I think it was called The Contradiction of Home Ownership or something like that. But in American society in particular, home ownership is seen as like, oh, well, if you own your own home or own your own property, you've made it in society. Like that's sort of the American dream, having the nuclear family with the 2.5 kids and the golden retriever puppy and the house with the white picket fence, right? That you own. Like this is yours. Well, the bank owns it and you are locked into a 30-year mortgage. Right. But it's yours. So you just pay the bank for the house that they own. And after 30 years, it'll be paid off, but you'll have student loans that you still have to pay, and you got to pay your kids' college tuition. But forget all that. But this sort of like precipice of the American dream has long been wrapped up in home ownership. Okay, but if you think about it, so I have to work really hard to afford this house that I don't spend any time in, right? I work 60 hours a week to afford the house that I don't even have the time to enjoy because I got to work harder to afford the house. Oh, so it'll be great to own a house, but I'm going to have to pick up an extra shift. I'm going to have to get a second job or something like that. But I own a house, but most of the time I spend in that house is spent eating dinner and then going to bed so that I can get up at 5 a.m. in the morning and start the grind all over again. Okay, so I need to work to afford this house. That's the goal. But I have to work so hard to afford the house that I don't even get to enjoy the house, which was like part of that whole American dream thing. Isn't that incredibly ironic? That's Yauman's point. In order to afford the good things in life, we got to work our asses off. Right? So that's why he thinks the compensation argument fails. So John Rawls' entire point is that to the extent that work is maybe not meaningful or undignified or unattractive, as long as we have ability for free choice in other areas of life or meaning making in other areas of life, it makes up for it. But work is a necessary means to those kinds of ends in the first place, and that's why it is a vicious cycle, right? Now, even though it may be true, according to Karl Marx, that all work is dignified to the extent that it involves, you know, freely using our creative energies or freely using our labor power, at the end of the day, whether or not work is dignified as far as social consciousness is concerned is a matter of whether or not it is attractive or unattractive to those within the upper echelons of society. And that's part of the problem. Okay, now, and where there is a sort of societal injustice here is when, on the basis of things like race and gender and things like that, certain classes of individuals are sort of automatically funneled into certain kinds of work, right, that are not as attractive as other kinds. And demographically speaking, there are clear demographic gaps, or certain forms of unattractive or undignified work is you know, predominantly, like if there are certain demographics disproportionately represented in certain forms of work that are not represented in other kinds of work, that is when we have an indication that there's some sort of systemic societal injustice going on. Okay. So, given the fact that we live in a country where most CEOs are white cisgender males, where we live in a society where white males own 99% of the social and political capital in the country, right? And they're in the upper echelon. And statistically speaking, as far as actually exerting labor power, those in the upper echelon don't work nearly as much as those in less attractive or less dignified jobs or whatever. Um, that's where we largely in this dichotomy are trying to have our cake and eat it too. Okay, so what's Yauman's point? Yauman's point is the classical liberal model, that model of liberal neutrality. That model of liberal neutrality operates on the assumption that everybody has equal opportunity in society, but that is not the case. There are systemic political, social, and economic barriers which prevent individuals of certain demographics from having the privilege or the opportunity to have those more attractive forms of work. Now, but if a meaningful or dignified job satisfies a deep human need, then socially we ought to promote more stringent conditions on giving more kinds of more opportunities to certain kinds of people that are disproportionately impacted by systemic injustice. We ought to have a society which is not politically not politically neutral in the classical liberal sense, but we need to have a society which is actually promoting justice and promoting beneficence to those that enjoy it the least. So we need to focus on particularly marginalized, exploited, and vulnerable members of our population and the kinds of work and jobs and professions that those kinds of individuals are typically funneled into. So if poorer people or marginalized people in society, people that are historically discriminated against in society, have lower paying jobs or less attractive jobs and those kinds of things because of past societal injustices and current systemic barriers, then we need to actively work towards removing those kinds of systemic barriers in order to give people opportunity for more meaningful work and to promote meaningful work. Okay. Otherwise, all we end up with is a form of classism. Okay. Now, and there's a particularly bad form of classism that we encounter it in places like the United States. Okay, and if I had to summarize it, here's how I would put it. So people are shunned for not working, but people are also shunned for not having better jobs. So people are shunned for not working. So if you don't have a job and you're not working to provide for yourself, you are lazy, you are a leech, you are a societal burden. But we also shun people who do work for not having better jobs. We can't have it both ways here. So if you don't work, if you don't pull yourselves up by your bootstraps and you don't bring home a paycheck to pay your own bills, and even if you have to work 2, 3 jobs, doesn't matter. That's what you have to do to pay the bills. You're lazy. You're a societal burden. You're a leech. You're a freeloader. But you're also shunned if you make minimum wage. You're also shunned if you're a fast food worker because you don't have a better job. Okay, now, but what does it mean to have a better job? To have a better job means to get paid more to do less labor. And this is the social contradiction that we find ourselves in. So, people that don't get paid to do nothing are shunned, while people who do get paid to do nothing are praised. So let me repeat that. People who are shunned for doing nothing are only being shunned because they are not being paid for doing nothing. But when you get to the point where you get paid a lot more to do less labor, man, you deserve my praise. So if you do nothing and you don't get paid for it, you're a leech, you're a freeloader, you're a societal burden. But if you do nothing and you do get paid for doing nothing, that is the best place to be in. This is classism through and through. This is classism through and through. Okay, so this is where the social contradiction is. We can't say that people ought to live by the work of their own hands. We can't say that people ought to live by the work of their own hands, and if they're not living by the work of their own hands, then there's something deeply wrong with them. While at the same time praising the CEOs and the company presidents and the CFOs who get paid bank to barely exert any labor. The fast food worker works a hell of a lot harder than the CEO does. And by working harder, I just mean in terms of the amount of labor that they actually exert. The fast food worker exerts a lot more labor power than the CEO does, but the fast food worker is shunned and the CEO is praised. So there's all sorts of inconsistency wrapped up here, but it's deeply classist. It's deeply classist. Okay. And I didn't think this was a secret, but that sort of classism is just bad. Now, and it's especially bad when class distinctions cannot be separated from racial distinctions and gender distinctions, which they can't be. Class and race and gender and what's going on socially and these kinds of demographics, these are all deeply interwoven with each other, as we'll see when we get into Hannah Arendt and Karl Marx and those kinds. Okay. All right. So that will suffice. I hope that clarified a few things, and I hope that inspired you a little bit to think about these kinds of issues with your own chosen profession and with the way that you think about your job, your education, the profession that you are going into, and the kind of person that you aspire to be. Okay. So, and I want to let me just repeat this. You are not your job. Your value as a human individual does not reside in your profession or your job. So please take pride in your profession. Please take pride in your work. But I would hope that you would understand that your deep intrinsic value is not at all dependent upon your work, is not at all dependent upon your job or your profession. You're beautiful and you matter regardless of whether or not you work, regardless of what kind of job you have, regardless of what kind of profession you have. I don't want to go all Mr. Rogers on you here, but I deeply believe that to be true. You do not matter less in the grand scheme of things because you have one of those unattractive jobs, because you have one of those undignified jobs, right? I oftentimes, well, not just in philosophical circles, in academic circles, it's easy to feel not good enough. I've been a professional adjunct for 14 years. I don't have a tenure track job. When somebody asks me when I got tenure, I don't get to say, "Oh, I've been tenured for 10 years." I say, in those kinds of things. When people ask me about my publication record, I just have to say I don't really have time to publish. I'm teaching 10 plus courses a semester at several different schools. Is it easy to feel like a deep sense of not belonging and a deep sense of not being good enough and a deep sense of I'm not in with the in crowd. Yes, it's very easy to feel that way in higher education and in academia in general. But man, the friendships that I've formed in the profession and the people that are fellow philosophers who deeply value my contributions to the field, even if they're minimal compared to what they're doing. The student who says, I really enjoyed this class, I'm taking something from this class, whether it be a student from Calvin or a student from College of DuPage or a student from any one of the other colleges that I teach at. that makes up for the hard times, I think. On most days, that makes up for the hard times. But man, I get it. And I'm in this with you guys just as, I get it. So many of you are entering your professions and you're going to feel that kind of pressure. You're going to feel like a failure in your personal life because because of some seeming failure in your professional life. But it doesn't have to be that way, and it does get better. At least I hope. All right. Okay. So I don't want to preach a sermon at you, but yeah, I think that will suffice for now. And again, if you have any questions on this, please do not hesitate.